everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Paideia Today. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and I am joined here, as always, by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. And today we are back at Paradise Lost, looking at a book of the text, which oftentimes gets passed over when it comes to close readings, discussions in classrooms, things like this, or even indeed research and publication, which is Book 3. Book 3 is so loaded with interesting theological positions, problems, insights, that to skip it is to essentially endure a great loss, as it were, from the text here. And I understand that this is also one of your favorite books, Dr. Masson, to discuss because it's just so incredibly rich. Can you say a little bit about, particularly at the beginning here, as we look at how Milton starts off Book 3?
Yeah, I'll say a few things, and then I'm hoping to read a fair bit of it as well. Milton began, if you recall, back to the first episode on this when we talked about Book 1, in his invocation right at the outset, he said that he was going to justify the ways of God to men. That was how he concluded the invocation. And most anthologies, which is the way most people access Milton these days, if they read Milton at all, they read it in an anthology. And the anthologies leave out wholly Book 3 of Paradise Lost. They tend to cut great chunks of it for the purposes of presumably economy. I don't know. But if Milton announces that justifying the ways of God to men is his theme, it seems to me, whatever one thinks of that, if you're going to present works in an anthology, that you have to allow God to speak and explain why what's happening is happening. And that's what we get in Book 3, and we don't get it anywhere else nearly as clearly at any rate. And we get with it also all sorts of companion passages to those which we just read about in Book 2. So the Infernal Council in hell, and also the encounter between Satan, sin, and death. So the Infernal Trinity, as it were. We find that echoed here in Book 3. So there are various literary parallels and echoes here, which I think, you just simply can't leave out. And then it deals with matters of great import to the entire epic, which I think I'll expand on in comments when I get to the passages concerned, but matters such as conscience, what the real nature of paradise is, the nature of hell. Those things are dealt with only when we dig into Book 3. So it is a key book.
Yeah, it has so many elements actually which are meant to, again, substantiate that reading dynamic of repetition and variation. We've got another council, supernatural council. We have points within the council and within the location here. Now we're in heaven rather than in hell. And we've got elements to that which are also designed for direct comparison one to the other. So the reader is bereft of that. We have, as you say, major plot developments and the causality behind those plot developments unpacked for us here in Book 3. A reader is genuinely crippled in his or her ability to appreciate and enjoy Paradise Lost if they skip Book 3. And there are times when, as you say, in an anthology, the editors simply don't include that, which perhaps speaks to the editors, either what the editor is thinking or the elements of Paradise Lost of which the editor is ignorant. But
Or uninterested. They might just say, oh, that's the Christian stuff, and that's not the stuff I'm interested in, so we'll leave that out. But if your argument and my argument is correct here, which obviously we both think it is, what Milton has done in books 1, 2, and 3 is he has posited the heavenly council, which we find at the outset of every epic before this, at least the pagan epics, the of the Greeks and the Romans, and set them in different places. And so can you imagine the dialogue between Athena and Poseidon in, let's say, the Odyssey, in which we only listen to what Poseidon said,
yeah,
and not Athena, because that's effectively what we're doing then if we exclude Book 3.
yes, absolutely. Essentially, it's It's censoring God and his position on all the developing affairs that we encounter in Paradise Lost. And yes, it is not as grimly dramatic as the scene that was set in hell and the council that occurs in hell. And a lot of people have their imaginations fired by what they encounter there. But nevertheless, it's still a scene also. And this is a charge that rather annoys me. A lot of people say book 3 is rather intellectual and boring. Well, if you're actually a somewhat intellectually inclined individual, you'll find that a little bit insulting. Intellectual matters can be, not necessarily, but certainly can be absolutely thrilling. And I do like to get into the ideas that are in book 3. But as you and I have previously discussed, oftentimes I simply don't have time and scope to give it full treatment. So usually I'll talk about the ideas in abstract at the beginning of my discussions in class about Paradise Lost, but I won't dive directly into book 3. But it is a great loss, my decision to do so, and I'm fully and painfully aware of that.
Repent.
Shan't.
Anyway, shall I read a bit of this?
Read a bit of this, please.
So what just a prefatory comment. Book 3 begins with an invocation. It's another invocation. So this is not common. We do find it. I think Dante may do it in the Divine Comedy. I think there's an invocation in Canto 2 of the Inferno, and once again in the Purgatorio there. So there are multiple invocations, but Milton does it 4 times. He does it here, or really in book 1 at the outset. He does it here in book 3 for reasons which will become clear in a minute. He was in hell and now he's coming into the presence of God. So for that reason. He does it in book 7 when he's going to talk about the constellations and about astronomy, and he invokes Urania, the muse of astronomy. And then he does it in book 9 because now he's going to talk about the fall of mankind, and he's going to renew his sense of the heroic importance of what he's about to say to the reader. So those 4 invocations there, and so they punctuate the book in that way. But let me begin then. So we left utter darkness. Remember, light being the connotation of God, and darkness, the absence thereof, with these words: Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven's firstborn, or of the eternal, co-eternal beam, may I express thee unblamed, since God is light, and never but in unapproached light dwelt from eternity. Dwelt then in thee, bright effluence of bright essence increate. Or hear'st thou rather pure ethereal stream, whose fountain who shall tell? Before the sun, before the heavens thou wert, and at the voice of God as with a mantle didst invest the rising world of waters dark and deep. One from the void and formless infinite. Thee I revisit now with bolder wing, escaped the Stygian pool, though long detained in that obscure sojourn. And I'll leave it off there and skip a few lines down to line 32 here. He says, nightly I visit, nor sometimes forget those other 2 equaled with me in fate, so were I equaled with them in renown, blind Thamyris and blind Maeonides, and Tiresias and Phineas, prophets old. I'll stop there and I'll move down to the final extract that I want to deal with, 40. Thus, with the year seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of even or morn, or sight of vernal bloom or summer's rose, or flocks or herds, or human face divine, but cloud instead, and ever-during dark surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair, presented with a universal blank of nature's works, to me expunged and raised, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. So much the rather thou, celestial light, shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate. There plant eyes, all mist from thence purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. So 3 extracts taken all from the invocation. I apologize for not reading the entirety, but it's 55 lines and the podcast is going to go on very long. So we're going to read lengthy extracts today because it's hard to cut. But he begins with an invocation of light and speaks of light, obviously in multiple forms. The physical light with which he ends that invocation, the thing that he no longer can see, because remember, Milton is blind. And he's emerging from hell in a place of utter darkness, physical darkness and also spiritual darkness, to a place now of light. But it's not just light of the light of the sun, although there is an analogy to be drawn there, but it's not a precise analogy. It is an analogy. The physical light is, in some sense, the way we experience and understand references to light. But there's more than that which is meant here, because God is light, and never but in unapproached light dwelt from eternity. Okay, from eternity, but eternity is outside time and space, and light is a spatial, temporal thing. It's a manifestation. It's the means by which we see, etc., etc. So he makes all sorts of theological references here to God as light. He does get these directly from Scripture. The holy light here is identified with the Son of God. Pulling from both Genesis 1 and John chapter 1 here, and says that he has come out of the dark void of hell. And that's one of the reasons that he needs another invocation here, because he has been thinking and relating to beings utterly opposed to God, and probably because he's a sinner, is in need of, to present things that he's about to present to the reader, greater inspiration than he could ever have to describe things that are beyond a mortal, to not only a mortal but a sinner to describe, namely a holy God. So he starts with that, then he moves to those 2 or 4 figures rather, line 33, those other two equaled with me in fate, so were I equaled with them in renown, blind Thamyris and blind Maeonides. Thamyris is mentioned in the Iliad, book 2, a poet prophet, and Maeonides, on the other hand, is Homer. And Tiresias and Phineas was blinded. Phineas was blinded by the sun, and Phineas, prophets old. Okay, so he makes references to poets, epic poets at that, and prophets, and both of them he's courting comparison with himself. Now recall Dante was invited in limbo into the company of the epic poets. They greeted him as one, they knew about him already, etc. So and he was happy to be, and he was led through the Inferno and up most of the way to Purgatorio by Virgil, of course. But he's also claiming a prophetic element to his sense of calling here, and that's interesting as well, and obviously is related to his Christian vocation here. And then he concludes with again the reference to his physical blindness, and he is part of the wisdom of the world he's cut off from because he cannot see. But the recompense for that, which he prays for, is that the light, the spiritual light of God, would irradiate and shine inward, and the mind through all her powers their irradiate, and their plant eyes all mist from thence dispersed, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. So he's going to talk about things that cannot be seen, and yet this is the true source of light. And so that's why he needs this particular invocation. He is now going to talk about purely spiritual matters and not those that can be understood and seen with the physical eye. All of those things. I'll leave it. Do you have any comments there, Bill?
I've got a lot of comments.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah. Let's start. Well, I'm going to start in the middle inconveniently and talking a little bit about prophecies and prophets and things of that nature. Again, in previous podcasts, we mentioned that one of the favorite words for a poet, certainly amongst the Romans, but also in a lesser degree amongst the Greeks, was vates. A vates is a prophet, and a prophet is a poet. So vates is this term that gets used interchangeably between prophets and poets, begging our next question. What does the activity of prophecy have to do with poetic communication and poetic aesthetics and things of this nature here? The modern mind tends to compartmentalize these sorts of things, where you have artistic, whatever the job of poetry is, it's over here, and whatever the job of prophecy is, it's over here, but never the twain shall meet. And I think a lot of ancient and indeed later poets saw that there was actually an extremely fertile intermixture of these two activities if you brought them into close proximity with one another as concepts and as undertakings. So what then is a prophecy? And there, of course, we're going to get into the realm of theology, and there are a million one contentious responses to just what that is. For my own part, I have traditionally thought of prophecy when it's in terms of poetry as the articulating of some great, and to use a dangerous word, sublime, transcendent, and eternal truth. That's what it is. It's an uttering of such things. And can that happen in a biblical context? Yes, of course it can. Can it happen in a poetic or artistic context? Yes, of course it can. Is there more to what is happening there? Yes, I think, in fact, probably somebody should sit down and write a long, thoughtful, well-researched piece of speculation onto exactly how that functions and what its history is. I think that would be absolutely brilliant. And maybe there is such a thing written out there, and I just haven't encountered it yet. So I'll let you respond back to that in just a bit. But we also have this a little bit at the end. I just want to set up my thinking on that, which is this notion. To me, there's a degree of actually quite genuine pathos as Milton sort of contemplates his own situation, because there's a great tradition also, as you've already signaled here, in prophecy of prophets to be physically blind. The material world is cut off from them. And of course, sight is overwhelmingly our dominant sense by which we engage, interface, to use a modern bit of jargon, with the world around us, and more importantly, with the people around us. And Milton has this taken from him, but this puts him in a long tradition of prophets who articulate these great transcendent and eternal truths, also having the material world cut off from them. And then you have this sort of compensatory notion that he invokes, that if his external material vision is taken from him, let it sharpen then at God's behest, not his own, not the body certainly, let it sharpen, as it were, his inner eye. Let it grant to him that kind of internalization of these undertakings, which to me is fascinating. I hear a lot of cheap, loose talk about how as time goes by and as modernity carries on, whatever modernity means nowadays, that there is a tendency of the human psyche in general, in at least in Western civilization, to become more and more introspective and internal. And I think that actually, in reality, if we did a proper, well guided study of these sorts of things, we would find that the tendency between internalization and externalization, between abstract notions and grounding ourselves in the material world, operates over time, especially within Western art, much more like a sine wave, and it has periods of greatness and retraction. But here I think we have Milton is being forced by physical circumstances to begin to look internally and to make this an internal thing. And we're going to talk, I think you've got a fair bit of stuff to say in just a bit on internalization and the dynamics of conscience and free conscience and how these things attach to virtue and righteousness and things of this nature. So that's just some of my preliminary thinking on what you've read, but doubtless you have your own positions on these as well. Could you say a little bit more about that, Scott?
Well, I'm wondering, I mean, this is a conversation, so these go, there's a little fluidity about them. I'm wondering, I do particularly have something to say about the importance of inner versus outer. But Milton announces it right here as his particular situation, that because he cannot see, he's cut off from something that most people can see. Certainly in Scripture, however, those who are sinners are called to be blind, are spoken of as blind, and even the leaders of the Jews who end up crucifying Jesus are referred to as blind guides and so forth. Blind guides, hypocrites, etc. Even though they can physically see. So the physical sight is, they have that capacity, but they lack spiritual sight. So that analogy is not Milton's creation. It's something that's already there in Scripture, which he's laying hold of and bringing out. The conflation, the vates reference there to the poet and the prophet. Yes, it's there in Rome. Percy Shelley mentions it in the defense of poetry as well, and he's no Christian writer. He just simply acknowledges that there's an element here which is beyond aesthetics per se, that adheres to the poet's craft. It needn't, but it can, and the best of it often does. And Milton certainly represents that poet-prophet tradition at its best, I think, for which reason I regard it as the great work of literature in any language. Not that I've read them all, but still, to my knowledge. And then finally, the Book of Knowledge Fair, and that, yeah, the inner and the outer. Well, I'll just say, yeah, I'll say something here, and then we'll dig down into the implications of it thereafter. The title of the book's Paradise Lost, right? And it's going to give us an account of how paradise was lost. He said at the outset of man's first disobedience in the fruit of that forbidden tree, which brought death into our world and all our woe with loss of Eden, until one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat, singing heavenly muse. Those are the first 6 lines, right? It's how paradise will be lost and also regained right there. So he's already given away the plot. That's because the plot's already known to his audience. He's not telling them something new. So the prophetic aspect of Milton here is not telling us about something which is going to happen that he is telling us that hasn't been told elsewhere. It's that he clothes it in the garb of the epic, and he expands on the significance of that for his audience. And what is that? Well, he has already talked about this to some degree. So Satan in book 1 claims that the mind is its own place, and in and of itself can make a hell of heaven, a heaven of hell. I might have flipped that around. But he says, it doesn't matter where I am, as long as I am what I should be. And that's unbowed and unbroken and defiant. And he will not get knee worship from me. I will not bend the knee. I will not. And then concludes with the boast, it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. So he claims there, the mind is its own place. Okay, so I am in the midst of hell, the deepest, darkest pit of hell, and I am still not here because I'm thinking I'm somewhere else. And as long as I don't submit, then I can make my own reality within my own head, more or less. In book 4, however, which we're not going to get into in this podcast, that's for a series that we just don't have time in our overview of these great books to get into. We find that with the prospect of Eden, because he gets out of here, he goes to Eden and he sees Eve in paradise. And we're told that when he looks upon her, he is stupefied, first of all, by her beauty, and he's disarmed of his enmity, because she is the fairest image of her maker fair, but also that he finds that he has a hell within him, and that he cannot step 1 foot from hell, because wherever he goes, hell goes, because it's lodged within him. So his vain boast in hell has been demonstrated here in book 4. So Milton is drawing this parallelism, this repetition, but a variation as well, between a physical hell, a place distinct from God, and also an inner hell. Well, here he talks about an inner a person within the mind and so forth. He's going to do the same thing at the end of book 12. He's going to talk about when Adam and Eve are expelled from paradise, and they have repented and they placed their faith in the Redeemer. We're coming to that in a minute. That if they do these things, and that So they have faith, and then they add faith, hope, and charity, the greatest of all the rest. Then they will have within them a paradise within, happier far. So they're thrown out of paradise, which is within the Garden of Eden, the place that's closest to God. But even leaving that paradise, they will have the consolation of an inner paradise of sorts. So again, these echoes and themes persist throughout the entire epic, and he's going to expand on that, with that, how that is important in relation to conscience. But let's wait for that.
Yeah, there's this notion here that's very prevalent, and again, a lot of readers don't seem to pick up on this, which is that there's a psychological place that you carry around with you. So a location is within you, and it is not just a place mentally and imaginatively and artistically. It is also a place which is utterly dominated by notions of justice and righteousness. There's a reason that the place within Satan that he carries about with him on his back, as it were, is hell. And he can call it anything he likes. He can try to avail himself of the dynamics of relativism and wishful thinking to call it something else. But the bottom line is reality doesn't care. And it's not just the external reality doesn't care. The inner reality, more importantly, doesn't care. Likewise, the paradise which is to be regained is a place which is an inner place, which Adam and Eve will access. And again, this is bound up with notions of justice, notions of judgment, truth, the dynamics of grace and sacrifice. All of this is bound up in an inner place. And I think one of the things that makes this aspect of Paradise Lost difficult for some modern readers is that we forget that many previous generations not only were better educated in terms of culture and history and theology and all these sorts of things, but they were also more inclined to read things figuratively, whether that be a book or indeed even reality. Their minds oftentimes would reach almost unconsciously for abstract analogies, and they would take abstract analogies and then compare them to actual visceral realities around them and stuff like this. So there was a tremendous complexity and flexibility and inclination to read these things figuratively. And so this notion here of an inner place, which is of course a figurative construct, would not have been particularly alien to a lot of these individuals. But nowadays we tend almost militantly not to apprehend things with any sort of figurative sense, abstract sense. We demand a literal reading of almost everything that we encounter. And so many of us are not inclined and certainly not trained to engage with this notion that you're talking about here, as well as perhaps we should. So I think that's one thing that comes across from that.
That was a great comment. And one of the things I observe to my students is, what is the mind that he speaks of here? What exactly is that? And it's not, or the soul for that matter, but what's the mind? It's an immaterial thing. It's not the brain. Modern psychology, I mean, there was once a debate. There's now, it seems to me, a pretty crushing weight of opinion amongst those that are the doctors in this discipline, that the brain is the mind, and therefore disturbances of the mind can be dealt with
by dealing with the brain,
brain chemistry and so forth. That suggests all sorts of things which I think are nonsensical and deeply problematic, because if that's the case, then reasoning is not possible, because reasoning is not a physical chemical thing, in which case what we call reasoning or even thinking or imagining isn't, it's epiphenomenological. It's just the appearance to us that we're thinking. We just sort of a delusion that we're thinking, but we're not really thinking, in which case we're just, I don't know what we're doing. We're feeling anyway. And of course, then the consequence of this is people that think that matters that we're talking about here are irrelevant then, or delusional, or simply irrelevant, I guess was the word I used. And so we should leave that off, or let's cut that off. Now, but from these things, the consequence of this idea that there's something such as the mind, and that the things that the mind fixes on and regards as most important, and you said that, justice, truth, beauty, goodness, all of those sorts of things which have been there and emphasized from not the time of Christianity, but from the time of the ancient world, are now rendered irrelevant that is the consequence of this reductionism. And it is a reductionism, and it is a scientism, and it's a total abrogation of every intellectual discipline, including that of psychology, I would say.
Yeah, I had a very interesting conversation with an individual who used to be head of surgery here in Ontario. And we were discussing precisely this tendency, the tendency towards scientific materialism, which we're encountering. This is a massively growing, I would call it an epidemic. And the motivation that draws people, that attracts people to scientific materialism, oftentimes it seems, and I'm just speculating now, to be derived to some extent from just simple old-fashioned laziness. They don't want to think about the complexities of the human experience. And also, in many cases here, an inability. A lot of people don't have, they're not equipped to take their thinking further than mere scientific materialism on many matters. It also excuses you from a lot of the weight of being a moral and ethical
Exactly.
of your society and your culture. It's all just down to gears and levers and the mechanics of the body, the mechanics of the brain, as you say. And everything is reduced down to this sort of flat level. Well, maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. One of the results of this, however, is an incredibly shallow apprehension of the world, and quite frankly, an evacuation of value from art specifically here, literature in particular. But of course, that's where many other later thinkers, that's precisely where they went when it came to the purpose of art. What is art's purpose? And you and I have spoken about this previously, so we'll leave that for the time being.
I think we can go on about this all day, because this just keeps spiraling out, and the implications, and this is an almost endless conversation. But we're not going to get through this if we do that. And we're already well into the podcast. Let's move on to the next extract I'd like us to look at, though, which is, having invoked the light, he then moves to those that inhabit this region of light, and that is the Father and the Son. This is where the dialogue begins. And here it's not a discussion between multiple parties, as it was in hell. It's two parties, the Father and the Son.
Mm-hmm.
And we see God now portrayed. And one of the best objections I've ever read on this subject to this is that Milton is daring to portray God and give him language furthermore, which is maybe the reason why he needed to pray for what is about to come, because he is actually doing something which is rather extraordinary, to put it, and potentially impious. Dante did not do such a thing. His God does not speak. He sees something that he can't see, and it's, of course, clothed in light, but he can't hear it. But here he does. Milton does.
Mm-hmm.
And so, however with that in mind, however he presents this, he's going to fall short of the reality and the majesty of God. Having said that, I think he does as best a job as anyone could. Anyway, but what we find then, so we have the Father, God the Father, looking, and he's seeing Satan rising from hell and is transported towards the earth in order to do something. And he sees them from his prospect high, we read, wherein past, present, future he beholds, and thus to his only Son foreseeing spake. And I'll do you want to comment on that, first of all, the prospect there? And that's interesting, and it is why one of the reasons why he's separated from Satan and hell, because this is a place from wherein past, present, future he beholds. It's not a place. He's not on Mount Olympus.
No, he is outside of space and time. We have to remember that he creates space and time, and thus he is himself both within it and outside of it. And this has major implications in terms of how the plot is going to develop, because this opens up the scope also for God's omniscience. He knows the future because he is beyond it. He's at the end of time, and he's also at the beginning of time, and he knows everything that has gone on in between. So this is also going to set up that classic discussion about does God's foreknowledge actually predestine certain events to happen, or is it just knowledge per se? And C.S. Lewis's take on this was very interesting. I may have mentioned it before. Simply knowing, as you and I do, that the sun will rise tomorrow. Actually, that's a bit of a dicey claim up here in Toronto in January, but still, you and I know that to be the case, but it does not necessarily follow that our foreknowledge predestines that sun to rise. We simply know that it will as an inevitability. So also Lewis said, can we talk about God's omniscience from a similar perspective? Yes, God does make certain events happen in history. This is indisputable. Everything is not all flux. There is a plan, there is a structure, there's a logos to what is going on here. But there are other aspects, spheres, if you will, where an event horizon opens for free will to play a role in the virtue of the events that transpire. And so what we end up with here is again, a much more flexible, a much more elaborate, and I would argue much more mature vision of time and causality, and these sorts of things. In fact, I would go one step further and be clear with my students to underscore the fact that actually things happen here in this history, not because of causes, but because of reasons. And again, as we make a distinction between brain and mind, we need to make a distinction between reason and causes. Reasons assume individual agency, individual initiative, the guidance by a series of principles and values that individual holds and chooses to do some things for reasons and not to do other things. Whereas again, if we roll this back to a scientific materialism, we're left in a world of mere causes. That's all we've got. And again, we flatten that world's profile and all that can happen within it.
This is a splendid observation, and it's a necessary one, because it really does hit at the heart of the problem of scientific materialism and how it invades our contemporary understanding of almost everything and discussion of it, because people assume certain things by certain terms, when in fact it is excluding the very possibility of something that is necessary to really understand it, and hence our problem.
Yeah, this is why I was dismayed by the book The Selfish Gene, because it only talks in terms of causes. There's no ultimate purpose in end. I thought this is first of all, this is quite a crude book using extremely elaborate machinery to get its simple job done. But it was also a little bit depressing because people were so impressed by the book when it first came out. And I thought to myself, even the ancients made distinctions between causes and reasons. Why is it not being made by the best and brightest nowadays? But that's now I'm completely off on a tangent. So
You're off on a tangent, and I'm so tempted to follow you, but I'll resist the temptation.
No, this is a windy path.
Yeah, no, I could not agree with you more on that, but let's not go there. Let me read from the passage, and it deals with exactly the subject matter that you just picked up there, but because readers don't read this, let me read, and I will read a fair chunk here, and you'll see how Milton frames it. So this is God the Father from his prospect high, where in past, present, future he beholds. Thus to his only Son foreseeing spake, only begotten Son, seest thou what rage transports our adversary, whom no bounds prescribed, no bars of hell, nor all the chains heaped on him there, nor yet the main abyss wide interrupt can hold. So bent he seems on desperate revenge, that shall redound upon his own rebellious head. And now, through all restraint, broke loose, he wings his way, not far off heaven in the precincts of light, directly towards the new created world and man there placed, with purpose to essay if him by force he can destroy, or worse, by some false guile pervert, and shall pervert. For man will hearken to his glozing lies and easily transgress the sole command, sole pledge of his obedience. So will fall he and his faithless progeny. Whose fault? Whose but his own? Ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such I created all the ethereal powers and spirits, both them who stood and them who failed. Freely they stood who stood, and fell who fell. Not free, what proof could they have given sincere of true allegiance, constant faith or love, where only what they needs must do appeared, not what they would? What praise could they receive? What pleasure I from such obedience paid, when will and reason also is choice, useless and vain, of freedom both despoiled, made passive both, had served necessity, not me. They therefore, as to right belonged, so were created, nor can justly accuse their maker, or their making, or their fate, as if predestination overruled their will, disposed by absolute decree or high foreknowledge. They themselves decreed their own revolt, not I. If I foreknew, foreknowledge had no influence on their fault, which had no less proved certain unforeknown. So, without least impulse or shadow of fate, or aught by me immutably foreseen, they trespass, authors to themselves in all, both what they judge and what they choose. For so I formed them free, and free they must remain till they enthrall themselves. I else must change their nature, and revoke the high decree unchangeable, eternal, which ordained their freedom. They themselves ordained their fall. The first sort by their own suggestion fell, self-tempted, self-depraved. Man falls deceived by the other first. Man therefore shall find grace, the other none. In mercy and justice both. Through heaven and earth so shall my glory excel, but mercy first and last shall brightest shine. So that's a lengthy extract. It went on for well over 100 lines there. And it picks up magnificent themes, themes that you've already alluded to there. But the language of it is so rich and so dense, and so it's literary language, the allusions, the analogies being made, the analogies between God and his creature, the analogies between God's freedom and human freedom, the analogies made between the creator and the image bearer, the analogies between the spiritual beings called angels and those called mankind, the one being falling without a tempter, the one with a tempter, etc. All of these being drawn through here, but and God is justifying his ways in some ways here. It's not that he's in the dock, as Lewis puts it, as if he were on trial. It's rather he is expostulating on his greatness and his goodness and his blamelessness. It's not a in question.
Yes,
but he is answering a series of unasked questions so he's answering those, and in that sense it sounds a little defensive, I guess, and a little bit like a theologian might, and this is again one of the criticisms.
I think the sense that I get from this is that this is a magisterial rejection of a number of potential accusations. You're correct. These are not direct questions that he is responding to. This is God speculating on the sort of things people might say of him and his role in the production of evil in the universe, which is real evil, to be sure. It's also, as you say, it lays out, and this is typically Miltonic in my view, the argument, as it were. Milton likes his arguments. Most people in his day who are intellectually and artistically capable like a good, strong, vigorous debate. And so this is, to some extent, Milton beginning to hedge in those directions here. He's got reasons for why he says what he says. And of course, in this passage you just read, you have Milton's famous free will defense. Unless mankind, and indeed the angels, had free will to either be obedient or disobedient to God's command, whatever that command may be, And then the goodness that is produced by that act without free will behind it will be negated. So they have free will, but this also means that they have responsibility. You can't have both of them. And this has been a traditional approach that a lot of people will grumble about. A lot of people will grumble about the fact that we do or do not have free will, or if we do have free will, no, sorry, that we ought to have free will, and it dignifies the human condition if we have free will. But then, of course, a lot of people don't want to take the responsibility of having free will. So which one is it? You can't have one without the other. It's a package deal. So God is laying that out here as well. Scott, there's so much to say here. I don't want to.
It goes back to what you said, though. We have free will. They want to assert that so they can do whatever they want. On the other hand, because we're all the product of our brain chemistry or selfish genes, we have no responsibility for it, and there's no consequences for it either. So the accusation that their position is anything other than not just contradictory, but utterly bankrupt of any integrity, I don't see how it's defensible. I simply don't.
No, it's mutually contradictory.
It really is. Now, when it comes to this issue of freedom, Milton has a very different understanding of it than our modern day freedom. Freedom is not autonomy.
No.
Autonomy is an Enlightenment postulate. And it is a postulate because it is a theoretical stance. And we'll get into that more when we move into that period, and particularly into later elements of the period in Immanuel Kant and so forth, in late Enlightenment thought. But autonomy is the idea of the law of the self. That's more or less what Satan is proclaiming in hell, right? The nomos, the autonomos, is the self-law. That literally, that's what it means. That is what Satan proclaims for himself. That becomes the ideal of freedom that is presented as our notion of freedom. And some say that it's from the Enlightenment, that our whole notions of freedom of speech and assembly and conscience, etc., they derive from this period. I think that is poppycock and nonsense. Mm-hmm. It may arise in and around this period, but it has nothing to do with the notion of autonomy or freedom of the Enlightenment. It has nothing to do with that. And the test case of this is in relation to the matter of conscience, and we'll come to that in a minute. But here he talks about the importance of freedom. Why free? Why did he create them free? Well, because otherwise, what proof could they have given sincere of true allegiance, constant faith, or love? Remember, God is love. And love is the center of Milton's theological universe as well. Everything acts in accordance with the purpose of love. I mentioned in book 12, that charity or love, 1 Corinthians 13, is cited as the greatest of all of the virtues that he would have. That's Milton's understanding. He's taking it out of scripture, but also Augustinian theology and that of Aquinas for that matter. And on through the Reformation and the Puritan age, the great importance of love moving everything. Well, you can't love unless you choose your object. You can't worship it if you have no choice other than to do that. And so he creates them free because they have no proof that they've given sincere or true allegiance, constant faith or love, where only what they needs must do appeared, not what they would do. Right? So it's the freedom that allows them to do the greatest thing, which all of our poetry celebrates, love. Right? It's this thing that is at the center of so much poetry in every language and literature, in every tradition. Love is of such primal importance. Well, it's even more important than that. It's not just in the relations between the sexes and so forth. It moves literally everything. It's not possible without freedom. But equally with that, in order to show that there's freedom, there has to be a possibility of not doing that. And that is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is. It's that you can't do this. Yeah. That's the one thing, the sole pledge, as God says, out of his obedience is that thing.
It goes some extent, again, I mean, while we're making distinctions between similar concepts here, maybe we should make yet another one here. God commands love. This is the greatest commandment, love of the Lord.
The greatest,
all thy heart, all thy soul, all thy mind. But it's a command. God commands us. He does not compel us. That's a different thing. You cannot be compelled to love. But here, now we get back into more tricky thinking, because there are certain schools of thought, even quite early. I'm thinking here of some of the drama, specifically of the French neoclassical period, where love is presented as something which is, uh, when it strikes you, you do not have the powers to resist it. I think of Racine's Phaedra here specifically, where if somebody falls in love, they fall in love and they have no power to decide whether or not they will pursue that love. They love. You'll love who you love. We hear that saying nowadays. The heart will love who the heart will love, and that's just it. No, now we're back into a world without choices.
Right,
Now
like Virgil's Aeneid, when Dido's shot with an arrow by Cupid from Venus's direction, right?
Yeah, she does not have a choice in these matters. She is compelled to love, in the more tawdry romantic sense, but still it comes to the same thing. And we have this kind of thinking that persists with us. It's probably been around forever and a day, and it's very much, again, I think, a dominant way of conceiving of love, whether that's love for other human beings or love for God or love for whomever. We talk about it as a compulsion, and at least implicitly, when in point of fact that again is a stance which is going to evacuate loving from any sort of ethical or moral value
And at
whatsoever.
the same time, they'll say it's a matter of human rights that they can love whoever they want to love, etc. Right?
Yes. So again, you're caught on the horns of your own contradictions. Which which one is it? Unfortunately, a lot of modern thinkers are not particularly concerned by contradictions. So it's not enough for you and I to point out the fact that this is a logical contradiction. But that's again a different discussion.
Reasoning is white privilege, Bill.
I'm glad you told me. You worked your way through to that, did you?
I do what I'm told.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I think you've really unpacked well the thinking here that goes along with these sorts.
But then he talks about the fact that he has foreknowledge of it, and he says, in which case it raises the issue of as if foreknowledge had an influence on their fault then, or predestination overruled their own actions. And he directly says that is not so, because they are free. Because they are free, they're the authors to themselves of what they choose. And therefore, and he says, for so I found them free, as in founded, and free they must remain till they enthrall themselves. At which point they are no longer free in the sense. Now, what is freedom then? So after they fall, they're enthralled. Well, have they not got freedom to do things? Yes, they have freedom to do all manner of things, but they're no longer free to worship God aright, because he is holy and they are sinners, and they are barred by their sin. They are not free to do the one thing for which they were made. They're not free to love the ultimate good, the ultimate object worthy of love, the ultimate person worthy of love. They're not free to do that anymore. They're bound by their sin. And that is the hinge on which this whole theology turns, right there.
We've said this before,
yeah.
that concepts like freedom are freedom to do things. This is the famous Heideggerian position when it comes to consciousness. Consciousness is never just consciousness, it's always consciousness of a thing. It takes an object. Likewise here, when we're talking about freedom, freedom is never just sort of amorphously freedom as a concept hanging around out there. That's not a reality. Freedom is freedom related to the things one is free to do. And what these people are not free to do is they're no longer free to come into the presence of goodness himself, of beauty himself, of beingness himself, of justice himself, all these sorts of
loving love himself.
All they're bound to merely satisfy them with distant echoes of all those distant contingent echoes of his nature. And that's all we have here in the darkness that is fallen human experience and these sorts of things. So that I'm glad you targeted that specific freedom there, because a lot of other thinkers don't go there.
Yeah, and he finally concludes with the fact that man will find grace, and I'll leave it off with that. But the angels won't. But he will find grace, and I picked that up because at that point, because after that we're told that ambrosial fragrance filled all heaven. And then the sun, so it's this glorious word grace that comes out there, and the son then responds to this expression from the Father and says this: "O Father, gracious was that word which closed thy sovereign sentence, that man should find grace." for which both heaven and earth shall high extol thy praises with the innumerable sound of hymns and sacred songs, wherewith thy throne encompassed shall resound thee ever blessed. For should man finally be lost, should man thy creature late so loved, thy youngest son fall circumvented thus by fraud, though joined with his own folly, that be far from thee, that be from thee far rather, that far be from thee, Father, who art judge of all things made, and judgest only right. Or shall the adversary thus obtain his end and frustrate thine? Shall he fulfill his malice and thy goodness bring to naught? Or proud return though to his heavier doom, yet with revenge accomplished, and to hell draw after him the whole race of mankind, by him corrupted? Or wilt thou thyself abolish thy creation, and unmake for him what for thy glory thou hast made? So should thy goodness and thy greatness both be questioned and blasphemed without defense. Now note here, this is a couple really interesting. The whole gist of the Son's questions here is related to the Father's integrity and his honor. All of these things are related. And he's talking about grace, but he's talking about these not explicitly initially in terms of man and what he deserves and the greatness of that, but rather the consequences for God and so forth. Because otherwise, what Satan is going to do from our perspective, is going to do from God's perspective, has already done, because he's outside of space and time and so forth. All of these things would be implications of this. The terrible events told in the fall of mankind would certainly would suggest that God lacked power, and that Satan, in fact, had won, and that the creation which God created to be good had been perverted. And yet this word grace seems to, we'll have to expand on this, seems to overcome all of those objections there in one sentence. So it's a powerful phrase and interesting reflections. And just, we think of grace towards us. Here he talks about how it relates to the Father.
Yes. Well, this is typical of the human condition, to think that somehow everything that happens, particularly everything that is done by God, somehow has its significance in relation to mankind, when in point of fact, we are the contingent element in the equation, and God is the necessary one. So we need to keep that in view as well. And I think a lot of my students, even my Christian students, are still at some level bothered by the notion of grace, and I have to spend some time unpacking that. I'm not sure we have time to get too far into that today, but yeah, you're right. This is a package deal, and if you consider a lot of these qualities in isolation, they cease to make as much sense, and they are bled of a lot of their significance, when in point of fact, it's part of a larger model that fits together and works logically in relation to those other elements, those other qualities, those other characteristics that you and I have been talking about. What more do we want to say about
But
this?
note that God is not necessitated to do this. He is free, and the offer of grace is freely given.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
And so he's not compelled to do this by any token of the imagination.
No, this is why I framed my comments on free will, human free will, in terms of spheres within the wider ambit of the cosmos and time, as exactly that. They're spheres. None of this is to undermine God's omnipotence. God is indeed omnipotent, and his will is sovereign, and his ends will come to pass, whether or not we like it, no matter what we do with our free will. But within that, there is still the scope for human free will and agency and things of this nature, and therefore also, as we've already said, of guilt. We also need to be careful of talking, at least around Milton here, as if God is compelled to do anything. You mentioned the word necessity in relation to God, that God is necessarily compelled to do this, that, or the other thing. God is not compelled to do anything. I hear this language all the time, where people will say things like God must do this and God cannot do that. For instance, a favorite one is God cannot lie. If that is indeed the case, then you are saying that he is not omnipotent, or you mean something more limited by omnipotence. You don't mean full omnipotence. I do. You clearly don't. but rather God in his goodness as an extension of his nature chooses not to lie, not to deceive. He remains true to his own nature of truth, being truth himself and things of that sort. But that stops well short of a compulsion. Again, God is free and sovereign, and we have to be mindful of that here.
So when you say God can't lie, what I mean is God won't lie, and he
Yes,
never does.
that's much more accurate language. And there's much turns on, everything turns on that little adjustment, if you like.
Very good. Again, these are things upon which you can talk on all day, but let's move on.
Yes.
To whom the great Creator thus replied, O Son, in whom my soul hath chief delight, Son of my bosom, Son, who art alone my word, my wisdom, and effectual might, all hast thou spoken as my thoughts are, all as my eternal purpose hath decreed. Man shall not quite be lost, but saved who will. Yet not of will in him, but grace in me, freely vouchsafed. Once more I will renew his lapsed powers, though forfeit and enthralled by sin to foul exorbitant desires. Upheld by me, yet once more he shall stand on even ground against his mortal foe, by me upheld, that he may know how frail his fallen condition is, and to me owe all his deliverance, and to none but me. And then he gets into a matter of the difference between those that he's chosen and those that he's not chosen. I'll skip over that, not because I don't want to, but just again, space of time, and move on to another key point here. And I will place within them, those that he has chosen, the particular grace, the peculiar grace, those he has chosen as a guide, my umpire conscience, whom if they will hear, light after light well used they shall attain, and to the end persisting, safe arrive. Let me stop there and let us talk there on this, and then I'll move on to the next bit, which is it's an unbroken speech, but I'm going to break it up here because he talks about this umpire conscience. Now, an umpire is an adjudicator. Like, think of baseball, I guess. There's an umpire who calls the balls and strikes. In that sense, conscience will act here. Now, we have freedom of conscience as one of the rights articulated, say, in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and so forth. I believe conscience is in there. Religious freedom, but also freedom of conscience. Now, freedom of conscience is different than religious freedom. Religious freedom is a corporate thing. It's for a body of individuals who gather together to worship God. Conscience, on the other hand, is an inner voice, an inner conviction of the rightness or wrongness of something. And it is upheld in our charter and in many of the Western world's charters as a matter of great importance. Where do we get this from? It's not from the ancient world. It's not from the Enlightenment, furthermore, per se. It comes right here out of this, because it again comes with this notion of freedom and a free response to grace and an understanding of that. And it's solely based on that. And it does not have any other foundation, I think. And that will lead in, as it's represented in Paradise Lost, the angel Abdiel, who's in the midst of it. So in book 5 and 6, he's one of the angels, and there's a war in heaven. And Abdiel is one of the angels who initially finds himself in the midst of Satan's cohort, and when they're rebelling against God. And even though he's in the midst of all of these rebelling angels, he stands alone against them, alone, and he will not bow, and he calls upon them to repent. And so and he was, and this is Milton's phrase here, Abdiel found among the faithless faithful only he. And that one individual whose conscience has convicted him not to go along with the crowd, that is, Milton praises that, and the individual choice there, that is incumbent. Now, that is of great value. There's a great deal, I read nonsense in the papers about Western individualism, and we don't value the group, and it's all about the individual and stuff. That it's much diminished in our culture these days. It's not about the individual. It's not about that as if it was the group and the individual. So this is a sociological understanding. This is not a Christian understanding. It's not a correct understanding. With that understanding, of course, the individual means nothing. But that's not what Milton means here. This umpire conscience and the importance of conscience, the conviction of right and wrong, you could put that back to Socrates. It's the knowledge of justice, and it is there in some sense. It can be described in terms of everybody appeals to justice when they feel wronged. That's why they're angry. They know that both parties have an intuitive understanding when an injustice is done against them. They don't have an intuitive understanding. In fact, they seem to overlook it when they do it to somebody else. But the offended party knows that they have been wronged. Okay,
Yeah.
Where does this come from? Is it a brain chemical? No, they're appealing to a transcendent understanding of something called justice. Well, so does Socrates. Okay, but this conscience here is absolutely sacrosanct, and it's in our charters, and we supposedly stand for that now, except that we no longer do.
Well, this is one of the things I lament about Milton not being read deeply and thoughtfully by moderns, which is that freedom. Milton is one of the great champions of various types of freedom, and his freedoms are, as you've already pointed out here, extremely cogent. You can actually, these are not fluffy, vague umbrella terms that could mean almost anything depending on your context and perspective. He is at pains to map out just what the nature of these individual freedoms are. One of them, of course, which doesn't get treated at great length in Paradise Lost, is freedom of speech. And you and I could talk endlessly about Milton's discussion around freedom of speech.
In Areopagitica, yeah.
Yes, correct. But here we have another type of freedom. This is freedom of conscience. And both of these things, speech and conscience, I believe, are under enormous pressure right now. We are living in a very, very benighted age when it comes to freedom of conscience, as well as freedom of speech. And we tend to really, if we're going to zero in on any of these violations as people clamp down, we tend to focus on freedom of speech and its ever shrinking scope and ambit, which will at this rate disappear entirely. But we've also got this freedom of conscience, and I think this is a really relevant point for a lot of just about everybody in their everyday actual lived lives. We find ourselves increasingly in the West self-censoring. Some people tell me that they self-censor their thoughts and opinions more or less on a continuous basis as they interact with other individuals and institutions and things of these sorts. And if all of a sudden something slips past your self-censorship, it can literally spell your destruction, your social destruction, your vocational destruction at any number of levels. And so a lot of people in doing so are actually violating their own conscience. They are no longer free to, they feel that something's wrong, but if they speak out against it, either by commission or omission, then of course there are dire consequences oftentimes for this. And so this has a knock-on effect. Violating your own conscience and not doing or saying what you think you ought to do or say has a way of eroding your own sense of your own identity. It fundamentally undermines your integrity. When you look in the mirror, you can see a person who has betrayed themselves. They've betrayed their own conscience, sometimes because of extremely large threats, sometimes because of minor troubles that would ensue if they hadn't done this. But freedom of conscience is something that is, in my view, something that is dramatically under threat right now. And the consequences, especially in terms of self-image and self-respect, are huge. And if you lose your self-respect because you're continuously violating your conscience, you cease to see yourself as a person who is better than this or not as bad as that or anything like this. And all of a sudden the scope for your behavior in terms of good and evil widens, particularly on the evil side of things, because why wouldn't you do the bad thing? Because you no longer respect yourself, because you've been violating your conscience continually. And down you go. And the more you do that, the more that in turn erodes your self-respect again. And so it becomes a cycle as you spiral down the mountainside of virtue. And it all starts with this issue.
Yes. It's usually presented in slightly different terms. Jesus asked the question, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he should lose his soul?
Hmm.
His soul, I take as a reference to his conscience here, his rational, moral nature, his ability to choose freely, knowing what's right and what's not right. There's a great play by Robert Bolt called A Man for All Seasons, on which this whole theme is played out. Thomas More played as the defender of his conscience there, and suggests that if he does not follow his conscience, then England will no longer be England. And I would say that that's the case in our day. But there it's presented as a reward, in a sense. You can, and it's often, and the man who betrays him, Sir Richard Rich, does it for the reward of whales of all things. More as derisory. You gain the whole world, but for whales, yes. But it's often in our country and in the world, it seems, done for the sake of fear. It's not of it's, and so fear is the weapon of the enemy. Where's the courage? Well, the courage comes from the conviction that conscience is the thing, because truth is the thing and God is the thing. So it's a matter of conviction that leads to courage, and the courage is the thing that allows freedom to stand. It doesn't stand on its own. It's not something like atmosphere. We can talk about an atmosphere of freedom. Well, again, this is a figure of speech.
Hmm.
Freedom will exist where freedom is valued. Where it is not valued and not defended, it will fall. And it, as you say, it may be falling, but I resist that thought. I rebuke the thought, because I will not accept that this will happen, because there are free people these days still. We shall see. Nonetheless, God willing. But that he left off with that. Let's move on. He moved to the next section. He says, but yet all is not done. Line 203. Man, because there's a whole connection of consequences here. He said grace. He's going to give grace. Okay, well then that's the end of it. God has said man will have grace. But there's a problem here. Man has sinned.
Yep.
He's done the thing that he was forbidden from doing. God can't just leave this alone, because injustice has happened, and God, to be just, has to do something about it.
Hmm.
And grace isn't it. There has to be something that pays the punishment or the penalty for that. And so here we go. All is not yet done. Man, disobeying, disloyal, breaks his fealty and sins against the high supremacy of heaven, affecting Godhead, and so losing all. To expatiate, his treason hath not left, but to destruction sacred and devote. He with his whole posterity must die. Die he, or justice must, unless for him some other able and as willing pay the rigid satisfaction, death for death. Say, heavenly powers, where shall we find such love? Which of ye will be mortal to redeem man's mortal crime, and just the unjust to save? Dwells in all heaven charity so dear? He asked, but all the heavenly choir stood mute, and silence was in heaven. On man's behalf, patron or intercessor, none appeared, much less that durst upon his own head draw the deadly forfeiture and ransom set. And now without redemption all mankind must have been lost, adjudged to death and hell by doom severe, had not the Son of God, in whom the fullness dwells of love divine, his dearest mediation thus renewed. I'll stop off there. The problem of justice. God is just, and he must, in accordance with his nature, be just. He doesn't have to be just,
But he will be.
but he will be just because he chooses to be just. So again, it's not that God is compelled to be just. You know, it's part of his qualities, his properties. No, he chooses justice because that is what makes him just. He loves justice, and he needs to insist on that here. So now the problem, you can't just, grace does not get rid of the problem of sin per se. The word grace, it's
Yeah.
not erasing, and people have even said this in response to the atonement. is that why didn't God just forgive it all and leave it all, like get rid of it, say, oops, that was a mulligan or something, or well, forget about all that.
Because then a good God is not good, because goodness implies justice.
Yep. And a world without justice would be a world in which there was no judgment for the terrible iniquities we see all around us. People
Yes.
cry out against injustice. What do they really want? Do they want a world that in which there's no justice, in which there's no judge? They
Yes.
don't.
Yeah, it's fine if you're the victimizer. It's not so great if you're the victim.
Indeed.
The powerful and entitled, yeah, they would happily dispense oftentimes with justice. But people down here in the trenches, no, that is not a good scenario. That's an awful world in which to live. That's another form of hell, if you like.
It isn't. That's a good phrase for it. Exactly it. And go back to what I said. I don't know, it was last time, the time before. For the pantheist, good and evil are two sides of the same coin. They're 50 shades of gray.
Yeah.
They're just from a perspective. When we say cancer killed a patient, and we kill cancer, it's just killing. So what's the difference? No difference. But this is just language. It's verbiage. It's just a matter of perspective. Well, that's, as Lewis says, that's damn nonsense. This is not, and God, and certainly Milton's not portraying it that way. So here's the problem. And I left off and I read that passage about the response to God's. So here's what we can do. There has to be an intercessor. Somebody has to take on the consequences of man's sin. And it has to be somebody who is sinless.
Yes. And also, I'd like to note just very briefly a technical point here. Notice the awkward silence in heaven. Only Milton would give us an awkward silence. But it is mirrored by that awkward silence in hell when the great proposal was put forward. Who will do this thing? And so in both cases, an individual steps forward. But again, compare and contrast motives, nature, objectives, all these sorts of things. These two individuals are meant to be compared. So is Satan somehow the yang of Jesus's yin or something like that? No, he's infinitely beneath him, as he is infinitely beneath God, because Jesus is God and God is Jesus. Nevertheless, in a literary sense, yes, they are being compared here, not as equivalents, but as counterpoints to each other.
That's
and
foils.
what drives them. But we don't have time to get into analyzing that in detail. I think
That's why I read it. I'm glad you picked it up. Fantastic. And yes, Milton is clearly meaning us to see that there. So the son speaks in response to this after this awkward silence. Father, thy word is past. Man shall find grace. And shall grace not find means that finds her way, the speediest of thy winged messengers, to visit all thy creatures, and to all comes unprevented, unimplored, unsought. Happy for man, so coming. He her aid can never seek, once dead in sins and lost. Atonement for himself or offering meet, indebted and undone, hath none to bring. Behold me then. On me for him, life for life I offer. On me let thine anger fall. Account me, man. I for his sake will leave thy bosom, and this glory next to thee freely put off, and for him lastly die well pleased. On me let death wreak all his rage. Under his gloomy power I shall not long lie vanquished. Thou hast given me to possess life in myself forever. By thee I live, for now to death I yield, and am his due all that of me can die. Yet that debt paid, thou wilt not leave me in the loathsome grave his prey, nor suffer my unspotted soul forever with corruption there to dwell. But I shall rise victorious, and subdue my vanquisher, spoiled of his vaunted spoil. Death, his death's wound shall then receive, and stoop inglorious of his mortal sting disarmed. I through the ample air in triumph high shall lead hell captive, maugre hell, and show that the powers of darkness bound. Thou at the sight, pleased out of heaven, shall look down and smile, while by thee rays I shall ruin all my foes, death last, and with his carcass glut the grave. Then with the multitude of my redeemed shall enter heaven's long absent, and return, Father, to see thy face, wherein no cloud of anger shall remain, but peace assured and reconcilement. Wrath shall be no more thenceforth, but in thy presence joy entire. The marvelous narrative here, and again, I lack words to describe how wonderful the way in which Milton condenses and expresses the language here. You said it, some find it boring. I don't see how in any way this is boring, but note the reciprocity here, and at the same time, the lack of equality in the whole thing. So at the cross, the sinless gives himself for the sinner. What does the sinner, what does the sinful get? Or the sinless get? He gets death. What does the sinful get? He gets life. It's the great exchange as a consequence of the cross. This is part of what grace means, and it's expanded upon here. And what is not expanded on is the loss that the Son receives in becoming man, the humiliation, the humbling of taking on human nature. But he did not think it was equality with God was something to be grasped, but made himself a servant and did this thing. You have any comments on this passage? I think they speak for themselves, actually. But
yeah, just a few things here to note. First of all, that this sacrifice derives from love. First and foremost, love for God the Father. I think a lot of people miss that. They think it's primarily driven by love for humanity. And it is driven by a love for humanity, but this is, again, a contingent versus a necessary love. So we have to remember that aspect of things. We also have to remember here that as man is not free to come into the presence of all which could possibly be perceived by him as the source of goodness, so also in dying, the Son is going to be cut off from that presence. That's something I think that a lot of people tend to miss here. This is an essential part of the agony of the death of Christ. It's not just a mere physical death and the torture and everything that was bound up in that. It is a separation from goodness himself that comes out of this as a consequence. But
so he cries out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, right?
Exactly, precisely. That is the quotation I had in my mind. And also notice, again, the symmetry of concepts here, which I don't think Milton is constructing. I think he's simply making them visible, as it were, on the page.
Exactly.
That the love combines with this notion of grace, which combines with this notion of justice in a logical machine, if you will, that makes a lot of sense. It all comes together as a package deal. And again, a lot of people who are reading Milton read his ideas, never mind his words, in bits and pieces, and they never see the larger fitting together of these concepts here as large, complex, rational constructs. Though, again, as I said, construct is not really the best word to be using here. So, in this sense, obviously, God's wrath and his justice is satisfied by an individual who is blameless, as you say, for the sake of one who is blamed. Notice again here is God's love is not just God's love for those who please him, because obviously mankind has not pleased him. This is God's love for those who have rebelled against him, who have violated God's goodness, which is extraordinary, and some people find it counterintuitive, but it has precedence again in the Gospels. And the whole thing is driven by love of the Son for the Father, and the Father's love in turn for the Son, but also mankind. And so this is not the Son, by the way, earning God's love. This is the Son fulfilling his nature, just as God is fulfilling his nature, which is to be perfect goodness. Anyway, I could prattle on forever like this, but we've already gone on a fair time.
We have, I noticed that, and there's so much more to deal with in this passage, but you know what? I think we've given the readers or the listeners more than ample food for thought here, and maybe we should leave it off till next time. What should we talk about next time? Book
There,
9. Should we go to book 9?
book 9 would be great. There's lots to talk about here. And I think some listeners, if you have more to say about book 3, I think some listeners would really appreciate you opening up certain threads of thinking to them as well. So since you're the Milton guy, I'm going to leave the call to you. I will go with either option.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
You mean in terms of putting questions on the YouTube channel or whatever? I mean, I'm planning on, or we're planning on building a website for Paideia today, and it will offer more features, more opportunities, courses, and so forth. But that wait for that, more information forthcoming. But is that what you're proposing, Bill?
No, I was just
Okay.
talking here about book 3 specifically, though. That was a good point that you just made there. I think a lot of our listeners are unaware of our longer term plans with or for Paideia today. So that's useful.
So we'll go to book 9. We'll see where that leads us next time. Hope maybe we can even rope in book 12, but we'll see. Anyway,
Excellent.
is that it for now?
I think that's it for now.
Okay, well then I'm Scott Masson with Paideia Today, my colleague Bill Friesen. Thank you very much for being with us, and look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye
Take
for
care,
now.
folks.